How are you supposed to attract professionals to this area? People complain they don't have a doctor. What doctor's gonna come to Lunenburg County? You can't have the kids in a swimming facility. You know, they don't wanna drive to.
Suzanne, we are trying to go on YouTube. I just,
I
We-
just posted
No,
on my own, on my counselor Facebook, we're starting, our legal difficulty starting soon. See what?
You're working, not in the job.
could this possibly be? How could, what is happening?
It's just.
How is this happening? What is this?
Right now, we have
Because we're using the same things we always use, so it shouldn't be.
about thousands. Teams of parents using it over the course of the week. And you can continue.
Mhm.
And they will go to the pool after playing soccer.
But it shouldn't be a-
It's,
Okay, it's, I think we're live now.
Well, here's.
Kim will, you want Kim to verify? Well, we're just getting the conf. Audio back on. Should be all good.
We are good, we are recording as well.
Yeah, yes, it has been recorded and it's
Good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Mr. Technician.
Oh,
Good morning, everyone.
I think we just lost sound.
Yeah, only for that, it'll come back. If there's a delay, I turned it off on purpose if you wouldn't.
Okay,
you wouldn't want
perfect.
it.
Okay,
It's
sorry.
back on. Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, we're good to go. Excellent. Good morning once again. On this. First of summer. Warm day. Not much sun out there today, but. It is a nice day just the same because we are here in the town of Mahone Bay. It's always nice here. This is a special meeting of council. The agenda has been prepared, it was available online, we'll get to deal with that in a second. But we will first acknowledge that we are gathered today in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral, present, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And this morning, we gather with the intent followed by the living peace and friendship treaties. And we do so with respect, cooperation, and the spirit of coexistence. Call the meeting to order, council. You have an agenda that was emailed to you and posted online. What is your wish? Councilor Carver,
Move that the agenda be accepted as circulated.
thank you. We have a seconder. Councilor Rowan Sproff, you heard the motion on the question. All in favor? The motion is carried. There's only one item on today's agenda, and that is solar garden ownership issue. And I would note that following that, there will be a closed session on contract negotiations update. So, solar garden ownership. A topic near and dear to everyone's heart, I'm sure. Solar garden is in that glorious sunshine, just pumping out the kilowatts of power. Mr. Hyde, do you wanna?
If I could just briefly introduce the materials that were provided, and so this meeting was called in response to motion of council for last regular meeting. And there was a request that a memo be provided summarizing the two options and associated pros and cons. These are two options that council has essentially, decided to consider further. There had been in the correspondence with the board, a third option raised, which is the option of area owning the facility. That's an option the council wasn't elected to consider today according to that motion. So it's not reflected in the memo, but it is reflected in the correspondence. Yeah, so I mean, the memo certainly has some complexities. I'm happy to address questions, but that this was scheduled by motion of council. I'll go over to the council and I'm at your disposal.
Okay. Well, councilors. As Mr. Hyde suggested, there are basically two scenarios currently under consideration. One is town ownership and the other is owned by, to have it owned by the utility of the town, the electric utility. And of course, there are some issues that arise from that. Comments from the Utility and Review Board on the appropriateness of having the utility own and market the product, the electricity to the town. And there was also a comment on the NSU ARB perspective from Guinness and Cooper, our legal representative. So with that, council, what is your question? Councilor Kirby?
A question, thank you. How can we make a decision given the ambiguity of the NSCRB position? We don't know what the ruling might be on whether it would be acceptable to have a solar garden owned by the utility versus being owned by the town. So how can we make a decision without knowing that?
So
No, please, yes.
so I had the benefit of discussing this with the board on last Friday, so, you know, it was straight up talking to them about how do we get an answer, right? Because we only get an answer if we ask the question requiring an answer. So we have to essentially search to the board a position and do so in a way that they have a method of considering. And then have them come back and determine if that position is something they can support. So if we assert that the utility is the owner of the solar garden, they will need to test whether the utility is the same entity as the town, and therefore whether there is a legal distinction. If we assert that the town is the solar garden, owns the solar garden, then we will at some point have a board ruling on whether the town is distinct from the utility. But we will only have one when such a process is initiated that would allow them to come to that ruling. Yeah.
That helps.
What's the situation, maybe explain with respect to Berwick, who is also a member of the area, also has a solar farm, but they don't have the same problem.
So Berwick has a separately established electric commission. So it has a different board of governance from the council. It does have the majority of council members, but it has some other representation. That commission is considered to have perhaps a better case to assert its distinction from the town. That's implied, it's not definitive, but it's my understanding that Berwick has, it's the direction they've been going is to say that they can have a direct power purchase agreement between the town and the utility, because the utility is a commission, they feel confident that they can assert that. Ultimately, they will not get an answer from the board on that until they have to make a filing where they are actually relying on the PPA, either as a flow through because the PPA changes, or through a GRA where they cite the PPA as part of their overall purchase. So, you know, the board isn't necessarily going to invite themselves in to rule, even in Berwick's case, just because Berwick writes and says, we're going to proceed on this basis until the board actually is called into it through either flow through or a general rate application process. Is my understanding. Now, the board could decide upon simply being advised that they have jurisdiction to make a ruling. I can't say that's impossible. That I have no indication that they have a desire to do that, but that is still a risk that we can consider if we were to go with the town ownership model, is that the board might proactively decide, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, to make a ruling that could confirm or disrupt that.
So Berwick has what is deemed to be an arm's length relationship between the town and their elected commission?
It's deemed by them,
Yeah,
and there's a sense that it is more defensible before, it
okay.
hasn't been deemed by the board, that's still a gray.
And we don't have that because our utility is one of the departments of the town, not a separate legal entity.
Yeah, for lack of a separate governing body, there is a harder case to be made about the independence of the utilities,
Yeah,
but it's still a case to be made, like if that is still something that has not been tested. If Berwick feels more voltage because they have that to assert, you know, we even have a separate governing body. But we also have a number of things that separate the utility from the town. The one that Berwick has that we don't have is that. We still have financial statements and other ways the province is always considered as distinct entities. But, you know, this is the board, not the province.
Deputy Mayor.
That, you know,
So in my view, it looks like a simple enough position, but not simple in some sense that would say that the town will be for the utility. The curiosity I had, maybe because I missed the last meeting, this is a big time. So they've not started with it. That needs to be something we should.
I could give one, but I wasn't asked in the setup of this meeting,
So I'd love to get that, because basically it just helps the 7 of us figure out what stuff then will be an easier process. The sense I get right now is that we'll make a decision, the URB determines how that impacts us, and if it comes back, then you can still make a decision to go the way the URB wants, so it's not final per se to the.
so, yeah, I guess.
No, go ahead.
So, I mean, as far as that goes, it is, you know, a simple decision, and as you say, if we make a decision that the board were later to rule in the opposite direction, we would just have to correct it. I mean, that's really just something we keep in mind as a consideration moving forward. You know, for example, if we decided that the town were to own the facility and the town has made any proceeds off of that ownership through a power purchase agreement, then the board could later determine that that was invalid. The town maybe wants to reserve those proceeds until we go through a DRA process, so that ensures that we could refund them to the utility if that came on.
Okay.
If it was a part B, I don't know if
I just want to clear, and maybe you can help me with this, but if we chose to decide the town on the utility, we would be asserting that there's a legal difference between the two entities. And we do a PPA and we all that, and all as well, until the UARB makes a ruling, that somehow it gets in front of them and they make a ruling, and then they say that's fine. But they may not, in which case the ownership of the utility would have to read the ownership of the solar would have to read the utility. Now, the other side is more complicated, because if we assert that it's owned, that the solar planning is owned by the utility, we're in violation of section 35 subsection C, some blah blah blah, which says that we can't be a $250,000 or more capital program prior approval.
Yeah.
But it's already done, so then we have to go back in hand and take the permission to do something we haven't done. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure that everyone understands. Either way, it's complicated, very complicated.
Deputy Mayor.
That's just going to the second part.
the recommendation.
Yeah. the
Yeah.
recommendation.
So I mean, as far as the recommendation from staff, Madge and I have talked a lot about this. You know, if there is a possibility of establishing a precedent for a PPA between the town and the utility, or having the board say that it is legally distinct, if the two things are legally distinct, there is a lot of benefits. At the end of the day, you know, we've talked mostly about whether the town retains any earnings. But that's optional, like that's neither model requires the utility or the town to receive the financial benefit in whole or in part, like you can put that slider wherever you want to under the model of town ownership. under the model of utility ownership, it's more complex in the long run, you probably can also, and we talked about that, but you could probably also achieve a distribution benefit between the utility and the town in either model. But if you're going through this town ownership model, the real benefit has to do with how prices change for the customer. Because the GRA process is extremely cumbersome, extremely costly and extremely time consuming. And we asked the board if they had any appetite to streamline that process. And my estimation, the answer was a clear no. So that, really we need to understand that for a small entity like ours, if we spend $100,000 every 2 years on a DRA process, that's $50,000 a year cost to residents. That's $50,000 a year. When you talk about the total solar energy being about $300,000 a year. So you're gonna take right off the top of it, we're gonna take 50,000 off the 300,000 to pay the board to set the rates. So, if we could get into a situation where a power purchase agreement was accepted by the board, then we have a pretty good precedent to establish a flow through mechanism. The board has indicated they will streamline that process. So when you have established PPAs, like as we have with Eller's House, there's an understanding from the board that if area were to change that PPA and the town were to accept the change in that PPA, you could then apply to flow through the equivalent increase in customer rates or decrease in customer rates, but it would translate into a change in customer rates in a process that took, 3 weeks last year and no external consulting time. And,
Yeah.
I mean, basically no costs relative to the DRA process. So when we took, in the previous context, we were purchasing from SBI, we really needed DRA for everything but the internal costs of the ability. We took 15 years between DRAs. Well, 15 years for $100,000 process isn't that bad. But if we're going to want potentially vary based on increase or decrease in production costs, we need to be more responsive than that. And going back every 2 or 3 years in the DRA is really to be avoided. So what we ideally get into a situation where all of the utility power is purchased in ways that are allowed for flow through mechanisms, so that we can get back to the old days when Nova Scotia Power changed the price, we went for flow through, and that translated into an equivalent customer price. That's the process that is ideal, but with a complicated balance of supply, all of those supplies need to be coming in off of either the publicly approved municipal tariff or a power purchase agreement, or something that the board feels that they can give discretion to say, if this increase you have a valid reason to change your customer rate by the same amount, or decrease. Again, like this is not about increasing rates, it's about the ability to change the rates in response to changing conditions without having to go through like a tremendously time consuming and costly process. And the costly part I emphasize here, but I should also emphasize that the time consuming part, not only does it hit on our staff capacity in other ways, but it also results in a delay. So like it will take a minimum of a year, probably more like 18 months.
Yeah.
To respond to sudden change in costs. So if we got an insurance bill for a year and we found out our insurance rates had doubled, and we needed an additional $20,000, we needed an additional amount of money for anything that came up, it would be 18 months later before that would translate the rates. It's 18 months of running a deficit and then clawing it back through future rate. Like it's just, it's not the way we want to go. So when we think about all that, we say, well, the only way to achieve that in this case is town ownership. It's worth trying to see if the board will accept it. Because the consequence, worst case scenario, is they don't, and we go cap in hand anyway and ask for their forgiveness for having done it the wrong way. And really a pretty good excuse for doing it the wrong way, because it was our understanding, as we've asserted from the beginning, that the town was going to make a stand from the utility. And as long as we reserve any proceeds, like I mentioned earlier, I think we have the opportunity, we know we'll be free, right? It's 2 years this time, we will be to one with 2 years this time for other reasons. And then hopefully that establishes that this is a valid mechanism. And from that point on, we don't need to go to a GRA for a long time. So my recommendation is a very long way of saying would be the town ownership option. But ultimately, because that's the one that allows the other option as a fallback anyway, whereas the other option leaves untested the question of whether you could have had that legal distinction. In the long run, could be worth a lot to the ratepayers to not have to go through that regulatory process.
Council Carver and Council Wilson.
Quickly, first I just want to say thank you to the CAO for clear. It's clear enough for me to understand. It's very complicated.
That's a bit-
So I appreciate that. And it comes down to hearing the recommendation for the town only option, which so far I'm willing to support. But I do wonder, down the road, would there be any difficulty should our council wish to establish a commission? And what are the issues around that? Because I understand that there are some advantages to having a commission.
Yes, please.
So I think, you know, the town ownership model would suit the establishment of the commission in that sense, because. You know, we would have to decide on establishing a commission, what assets of the utility were going to belong to the commission. So if we've said, well, you know, these are all utility assets, we've got all these utility assets. If this is a town asset, it's a separate asset, so it remains with the town. And, you know, that PPA that was signed with the utility is now a PPA with the commission. If there were a request from the town to increase or decrease the PPA, because it comes from the town. Then the commission would actually be seen, I think, by the community quite well as the body to. You know, respond to that request from the town, like the commission could say, hey, look, the solar energy is getting a little too pricey, I'm gonna go look for an alternative. Now, I don't think that that's a scenario the town would ever allow to happen. We obviously want to keep that price at a level where it's the best source of supply for the utility. But it would be an independent body that would be making that decision. So, you know, for the public and the board, whose ultimate responsibility is to the public, that's an advantage. So it fits well in that structure. But, you know, I don't think there's also any reason to say if it was a utility owned asset, we created the commission. That's not an issue. It's just the commission would now own that asset as they would own the distribution system. And there would continue not to be any opportunity to make a distinction between the cost of production and the cost to purchase, because it would just be on.
Council Wilson and Council King.
Yeah, Councilor Carver's question sort of like to mine, which is there anything we should be doing proactively to make, I guess, make this thing look more like we need it as anyways, and make it look more separate. It clearly possibly is establishing an elected commission. And I say that partly in the knowledge of what may come down the road with music, the report elected. Like commission and so on, all that coming.
Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be that it is worth exploring what it would take to set up a commission. I think, you know, we have some budget for legal services, and I think that's a reasonable thing to consider. At the end of the day, there's a strategic question of, you know, were every municipal utility to have a commission, is that, is there an opportunity there for some type of consolidation, coordination? So, Riverports Commission was established by an independent active legislators, I think the Burns was as well, 100 years ago. Whether those legislations would, you know, allow for any change in those structures, they probably would. And so, you know, what's worth studying is the possible establishment of the Mahone Bay Commission, but also, you know, what if the Mahone Bay Commission were to provide service to another service area such as Riverport or Lunenburg? Would there be a potential to expand the service territory and add members to the commission in a way that, you know, was not confined for all time to Mahone Bay? And if Berwick and Riverport are locked in, is that something that we could build in that would be a growth model? And if Riverport and Berwick also potentially could be expanded, one of the options for Mahone Bay would then become, let's expand one of the existing commissions to include us, as long as the board representation is appropriate for that. So I think all three of those options could be explored. We do share legal counsel, Dennis Cooper is the legal counsel for the town and also for area, so that they would be able to provide this advice. I guess I have to go get a price, so maybe I should ask James what his take would be on what it would take to produce an actual report on this as opposed to just, conjecture. So I don't get a motion off, but I will, I think it's a good idea, I'll see what James has to say and I can figure out that. So,
Which party would they represent in doing that assessment? The town or Liverpool?
well, I think.
Or our area? Is that what
Yeah,
I'm saying?
this is of interest to Berwick and Liverpool as well, and it's probably very costly. So it is something, I think the ideal method would be to make sure the scope of work would represent everyone's interest, and then everyone could share in the cost.
I think we'd start with trying to tap a modernization grant to
Yes,
facilitate
and
that.
there's already been
Right.
some movement in that
Mhm.
direction, as far as getting funding to deal with like regulatory costs.
Counselor Bean,
Just a couple of thoughts, Marius, as I always feel when you say that on a complicated topic like this, but so, I mean, our thinking on the topic has evolved, but it hasn't really moved far off the original base case, which was town ownership. At the time, I guess the good news, and I guess the key message that should be reiterated to the community is that, like, this project was brought in on budget. And the cost of the production is substantially lower than what it costs us to buy power from NSP. So there's a debate about the strategic rationale of where the ownership should lie, and then there's a secondary issue around where the net benefit to the community should flow. And as we deal with on many different files, including fire, Remo, Joint Services Board, while the seven of us are sitting around the table as advocates, in this case, we have a dual role between the advocacy for both the taxpayers, but also the ratepayers. And so that is a dynamic that is a little bit unusual for the town that Berwick doesn't have to deal with because they have the commission that can act as the advocate for the ratepayers relative to the taxpayers. So we have to find the fine line of fairness between who should derive this benefit. So the town, it's true, has taken on a lot of risks. The town has incurred a lot of costs to finance, provide the interim financing, to provide the land, provide the overhead, the manpower, the staff time and energy to build the asset. And some of that opportunity cost is well known, and I think Ashley has a good first cut draft of what the overall cost of it, net of the government's grants. What's also true, we just went through this last month with the budget, is that the utility, we're running as hard as we can to keep up with the inflationary impacts on the utility, but the inflationary impacts on the utility continue to be a step ahead of us. So, I mean, I think when we started the solar garden, we would have anticipated a rate increase. We went to the regulator and we were successful in achieving that. But even with the benefits of the rate increase, and that's a benefit to the utility, not to the benefit to the community, obviously, because the utility is absolutely paying, the community is paying more for power, no question. But are they paying a fair price? Like in the minds of the regulator, they're paying a fair price, and in the minds of the utility and as stewards of the utility, it's a fair price today. But those costs are going to go up. So I think over the last couple of months, we've contemplated, well, what's the virtue of having a utility that's still cash flow negative while producing power at notionally all in below cost? So essentially subsidizing it. But meanwhile, over here, you have a secondary asset that's generating a yield, a rate of return, which would have to be used by the town and sent back to the utility to cover the negative overheads. So, I mean, from a financial perspective, having the asset generating a margin inside the utility has a lot of virtue, but it's not crystal clear to me that overcomes the strategic merit of having it owned by the town. I think I'm kind of default with the strategic value of having town ownership. The second issue that comes out of that is where the benefit should flow. So let's just say we conclude and make the decision on the ownership. Then there's another council decision, a secondary council decision about the PPA strategy. And should we be selling the power at cost, or should we be selling the power at the offsetting Nova Scotia power rate? And there's a few other options too, Bill, and as you said, I think you used the slider. So I think we should break those two conversations into two. And because the second conversation may be able to be something that's done annually. Like, I'm not sure if we have to lock in to 10 years or 15 years, or we have to make a 20-year decision. Like, maybe that's a decision that the regulator will allow us to make annually. I don't know. But I think this is a good memo. This is a good conversation to get the first question resolved, and then the second question could be more tactical. And I think it can happen on a more ongoing. I'm not sure how long we can run a deficit in utilities, so probably being more inclined to sell at cost essentially. But we'll and keep until the utility starts to meet its rate of return. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I want to say on that, because there are other points, which is that, yeah, the PPA can obviously be at any price. And, you know, right now, we said that the town is gonna be, our understanding is that for the time being, the town is the owner. The town is selling energy to the utility, and it's doing so without a PPA at the avoided cost of NSCI. And the board has said that that is acceptable for 2024, but they've also asked us to figure things out, and by the end of 2024, provide them with evidence as to the cost of production, so that they can see what the difference between the cost of production and the NSPI rate was. So, you know, I would suggest, but I think it's 60 days after January 1 that's been ordered. I would suggest that we want to have a PPA before that. Maybe having January 1 as the effective date makes sense in that case. But whenever we have it in place, it would be good to be able to say to the board, you know, this has been the differential because we're using the NSPI voting rate. Going forward from this date, we signed a PPA at this time, and now it's at a different rate. Now, again, the board doesn't have necessarily any reason to consider that, they're just telling them. But then they will be aware eventually when we come back into the general rate application. That PPA existed, that we had made an effort to set the price appropriately, that was some council's consideration. And, you know, so I would suggest that we have a PPA in place by the time we respond to that 60 days after January 1 deadline. And I would ideally, I would say make it January 1. Some of the incentive to leaving it till January 1 is included in Ashley's memo. So just to kind of call on that, we have a lot of interest that council talked a lot about on holding the various costs while we get credited back from the province and federal government. It's amounted to 29,
Well, we received
Interest today, you know, the carry.
263, 263,000.
So,
Yeah.
you know, we spent 262,000 of the town's money, outside of what we expect to spend on the project. Rather than rolling that into a long-term borrowing, which is what we thought we're doing, you know, ultimately would have to be rolled in.
Right.
Unless the differential of production costs versus NSPI avoided costs in this year returns monies to the town sufficient to address a lot of those things. So if this is one way to look at it, if we say January 1, we have all of 2024 where, you know, notionally we have no cost of production other than the insurance and very limited operation and maintenance in the first year. So we budgeted $280,000 revenue. If we spent 30, we spent 250, we would just about wipe out that interest. So that's just an option in terms of the kind of is a neat way to turn it over with the PPA kicking in once the town, and as it dealt with the staff times, you know, like a lot of other contributions from the town gone unrecorded here. But the biggest one, the financial contribution, has been these carrying costs, so we could neatly say that that was done away with in the same year by the proceeds of the sale of energy.
How much was that number again?
263,000.
Was the interest.
Yeah.
That was the carry cost.
Carrying cost. Deputy Mayor.
Yes, so, I really appreciate the separation of the, I guess, the distinct conversations we need to have. My understanding is that today, we just want to determine who owns, so that we can, have a lot of time to discuss it with you, but I think just when it comes to discussing it, there's a lot of nuanced conversation that needs to be had, and so maybe just for today, we can just park that.
And if we did decide on town ownership and we did decide January 1 as a notional date for it to be effective, that at least frames up the work that would have to be done between now and then.
And so I think I'm raising a motion for us to make that decision. And maybe another motion for when that conversation about it potentially needs to be done, so that we have, I guess, in our minds, when, plan for when this thing get done. Just, for me, just that moves us forward, because I don't think today we can really dig into whether it be able to happen. Are we there? Yes.
Before you park that car.
Okay.
Just one question, and that is, do you think that we would be able to get PPA nailed down? Albeit for January 1st before the end of this council term? Because I shudder to think what could happen in November. So the whole new suite of therapy.
Yes.
I used to use paper, but
Well, and that's, so for me, that's what I was saying, the second motion, for me, is whether staff think or not, is we determining one that could be done.
Well, I think, pardon me, so I think there's another conversation even within that, the second conversation around the rates. Is really around, like, the rates are a mathematical calculation, and it doesn't matter who's at the table, the math's going to be the same. The question is around where the benefits will flow as a policy decision.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, would be the focus from this council around the setting a fair process to figure out where the benefits should flow as a policy. And because the math behind the PPA will, I doubt that'll be ready for January 1, maybe it will be, but we'll see.
So to that question and the question of timeline, so like the real remaining unanswered question, like, oh, the ONM is unanswered, will be answered within July. I'm pretty confident we'll have answers on that one. But on the long-term financing costs, the challenge is that, like, our target is to get this into the fall debenture. As the fall debenture won't have a converted interest rate until it's issued, it's in October, I think, so.
Yeah.
So that's when we'll actually know. So if we set the PPA that it was, generously considering what the interest rate would be, we could do it any time, right? It would only take us a couple of weeks to draft up something we can talk about. But we won't know for sure what the interest rate is gonna be. So that's just the question council's gotta have a comfort level. If we're inclined to know for sure, we would have to wait until after the election. But if we're okay to just say, well, look, we had an issuance in the spring, we had the issuance last year, we had some changes in federal interest rates, so like we can make a guess. And be conservative with that, and this is only really relevant if you're trying to set the PPA as close to the cost of the document as possible. You don't need to worry about that if the PPA price is significantly higher. So that's the only constraint in terms of when we can do it. If council's comfortable, we can move ahead on a timeline that would get it done, but
I am pretty confident that we can set up PPA based on the numbers. We don't need to have an accurate rate for us to set a PPA. We just need to figure out, are we trying to make money or not? And the benefits, right? Yeah. And I think that's a conversation we need to have, and once we've had that conversation, for me, it becomes pretty clear. In terms of numbers, where we can draw the line, so I don't think even waiting doesn't have any purpose. For us, we need to make a decision. And if the next council may decide, oh, what those guys did is rubbish. In the period between October and January, they might say, well, we really need to change this. That's their prerogative, right? And I think since we've been the stewards of the project, what we're trying to do is set up something that the new council will sort of be able to carry through a decision that it doesn't matter the process, once they just get in, it doesn't become this big thing that they have to deal with. I think we have, in my perspective, and maybe ultimately disagree, I think we have the ability to make that decision. With preciseness for me in that particular case doesn't have to be that. The grades will not change from whatever they are.
So it's
by
cost plus,
cost plus, you know, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah, the
the
town,
cost being what the individual citizen is gonna contribute to the bottom line.
well,
If anything,
well, that's the big, I guess the conversation we would have about two benefits, because at the end of the day, even if it's a class. And it's benefiting the town, it's a citizen who benefit, right? So there's, I think, and I don't want to get into that too much today. There will be a time for us to discuss it.
Just, quick clarification, you're right, and I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, what we're talking about is if there's a difference between the cost of production and the consumer rate. Right now, the consumer rate is what it is,
Yeah.
and, you know, change that, we've talked about, there's mechanisms going forward, but that's a longer term consideration.
that's a great
You know,
deal.
what we're really just talking about is, how do we set the rate at which the utility purchases the energy? And where does the resulting surplus, if any, between the cost of production and the customer rate end up?
Cascade.
And if it's left with the utility, then it clearly ends up with the utility, but I should note that if it's left with the town. I think Councilor Finn hit on this earlier, it still can be to benefit the utility, because clearly the utility is running deficits. If the utilities definitely go back into the town, you know, it's. That question, or should the utility stop running deficits, I think at the staff level, I would say. It would be favorable to stop having the utility run deficits, and maybe that could be a consideration of where we set the rate. But, you know, even if you decided that all of the differential rested with the town, it could be contributed to the utility. And so, you know, we just want to keep that in mind for anybody listening.
Counselor now.
Yeah, Deputy Mayor. Great, got on to a good point there. We have to consider too, who's gonna do the benefit. There's a difference between the ratepayer and the taxpayer. Because not all the ratepayers that are part of the utility are taxpayers. We have to consider that.
And that's one of the reasons why, just incidentally, where the commission model has some advantages, because, you know, the commission would be able to have the same. Governance footprint. Yeah.
Deputy Mayor, I think that's a good motion that you're proposing.
Yeah.
You're gonna do
Let's
a
hear it.
you're gonna do a
What's the
super-
motion?
Yeah, I'm ready to move that, town council receives to comment, or,
No, this is a meeting, you can just do.
yeah, that the town council, my direct staff. Or what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
Direct staff to, are we ready for the URB?
Yeah, I think that, you know, the board has in their correspondence asked us to tell them what our decision was.
Yeah.
So right then advising them of their decision.
Yeah.
Is,
That the town wants to own.
and I think that's the whole thing, is because there is no way to formally initiate anything.
Yeah.
We just advise them that that's the basis on which we're proceeding,
Okay.
and then do your other motions separately.
So we have to do a motion. Nothing here, but you have to do a motion saying that the town is gonna be ownership before we decide to advise the UARB of that.
I mean, the only reason to do it separately would be if you feel that there's a certain like optics to having a motion on that. In the minutes and for the community. In which case you do that one first and then you do the other one, but it's not necessary from the board perspective, this would be equivalent to making that decision. via a separate vote.
So.
We didn't get the motion on the board, so it's still,
Yeah,
it's still
so we
discussion.
got a second, yeah.
Yeah. We are crafting the motion.
Yeah, you can keep talking.
Fire motion.
Kurt, so. I think this was a very valuable conversation. We don't have to rush this motion this morning. We can carefully. We could ask staff to craft, to provide the recommendation with recommended motions, and then we can ratify those motions at our next council meeting. Because I think that these motions have quite a bit of significance, and we'll have to be reviewed now. Like, let's just take the time to make sure the motions are, so that we can see in the minutes of the next meeting, we've had the discussions and the deliberations, and then our thinking and the process where we came to this conclusion is well noted in the minutes, and then we'll have a staff recommendation in a new or next meeting with some motions, and then we can, I think that might be a little more. Might stand up more.
Makes sense to me.
Now, the next meeting with council is next Thursday.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I mean, if the motion is only just that staff provide a recommendation. Then I can make that up. So,
It's really the motions for the council motions.
For the next study one.
Yeah, having it right
it's a
now.
one page report, so I can have that, I can impact them.
Okay, Councilor Curtis.
I appreciate those two discussions there, and, I would prefer to see the motion separate. So first of all, the decision and then the motion to, the UARB. I like the separate motion.
Yeah, so I guess I move the motion that staff brought for us. The necessary report.
Yeah, what I wrote is the council direct staff to provide a report and recommendation on solar garden ownership to council's next regular meeting.
Okay, so that's one first motion.
I mean, the old one today.
Second.
Kelly?
Yes.
I think, okay.
I'm like
That's
second.
Okay. Move to second.
I'm just looking down, so I heard Kelly, I didn't see it. So,
Can we have a reread of the motion?
yep, the council directs staff to provide a report and recommendation on solar garden ownership to council's next regular meeting.
Okay. So your question around writing to the UARB will come at the next.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Motion's been moved and seconded. On the question. All in favor? Motion is carried.
Yeah, I'm gonna do three motions for that one. In the report, yeah, on the ownership, on the writing report, and on the directing staff to proceed to graphic. Yeah, so that's what will be on.
Okay.
And that will be in the package. So for anybody who maybe had trouble with the, special meeting and being able to catch it today. So the package, it'll be out on Monday, so that'll be out on Monday.
So for any of the folks who are joining us from home who are interested in this particular topic. They can plan to tune into the council meeting on Thursday night.
Yes, yeah, the package on Monday or Tuesday and then the meeting. on-
Yes, meeting will be on Thursday night. And hopefully to have other motions on the same issue. Okay? Let's have a look at our trustee agenda. Are we finished with solar garden ownership to this point?
I believe so. If
Okay.
councilors are, and I had noted that the closed session was at a meeting, but I do need it just for a very short time. if that's okay.
That'll be the first.
Ah,
Well, that's part of you. I need it for a short time.
Only the CAO do his word, I need to go to process.
Answer questions from the public.
We we have a second to the going account. Okay, Councilman Carver seconds that. Folks at home, do you have any questions for council at this point?
See if we got it easy.
For anything that we have discussed this morning?
How many are online?
Yeah. We'll see if we can see.
3,493.
Record breaking.
We're subscribed to ourselves.
25
Really?
was
No?
record-breaking.
Subscribe to ourselves. Seems like we should at least be our own fan. Okay. 14 watching.
How many?
14 watching.
14 on Friday.
Well, staff are all in. So.
My
You'll let
team's
it.
watching.
And we just had a comment saying thank you, but there was no questions.
No questions? Okay,
All right, I'm gonna try to turn this off and then maybe Kim can just tell us if that's. Before we move
thank you
on.
to the folks at home for joining us.
See everyone next week.
Let us know what it's up.
Yes, yeah, no, it's not necessarily.